Eden Rock is a poem by Charles Causley that appears in the Love and Relationships cluster of the AQA anthology. It's a difficult poem in that it's very, very abstract, and yet the language appears to be very, very simple. But that being said, I think it's one of these poems that if you spend quite a bit of time with it, you do get something out of it. It does start to yield. So I'm going to talk you through the poem. I'm going to break it down line by line. We're going to look at the language features. We're going to look at the structure. And I'm going to give you really my reading of what the poem's about. We're going to start with the title, Eden Rock. There's all sorts of ideas, connotations associated with Eden, but obviously the thing that immediately springs to mind is the idea of paradise, the idea of heaven, the idea of kind of innocence and the beginning. And this is a poem. It's a poem that is about somebody dying and moving into the afterlife. So if we think about it in those terms, Eden begins to make sense, because Eden in this poem could represent heaven. We've got this idea of the speaker actually moving into heaven, kind of crossing the line between life and death and dying and going to heaven, and Eden keys in with that. Eden also keys in with the idea of paradise, and it's quite an idyllic scene that the speaker creates in the poem when he meets his mother and father next to this stream. And also Eden symbolises birth. If we look at the Bible, Eden was the beginning of man, and I think there's a sense in this poem of being reborn. There's a sense in this poem of the speaker as he dies, realising actually that he's not just dying, he's being reborn into something else, into another world. So Eden kind of has potentially three connotations there, and I'm going to put those up on the screen right now. The second word in the title is rock. Now, Eden Rock in the poem, in a literal meaning, is just a place. But if we think about a rock, what a rock is a kind of hard, impenetrable object. And if we look at the first line of the poem, "They are waiting for me somewhere beyond Eden Rock," you've got this idea of the speaker's parents actually being beyond Eden Rock, waiting for him. And as the poem goes on, the speaker moves beyond the rock and joins his parents. So if we think about that rock being a hard, impenetrable object that you can't get through, it's like a wall, the rock in the title could be seen as symbolising the barrier between life and death. It's an impenetrable wall that you cannot get through unless you die, if that makes sense. So the rock also takes on some symbolic connotations as well. So we've got this opening line, "Now waiting for me somewhere beyond Eden Rock," and then we've got a colon. The more astute amongst you will have noticed that there's a colon right at the end of that first line, and that colon forces a pause. And I think there's two ways of looking at this. The first, more obvious literal way, is that it's just there as a structural device to introduce what's coming next. What comes next is the father, followed by the mother. But for me as well, the colon has more of a kind of abstract meaning. If we are to take the idea that this is a poem about somebody dying and then passing into the afterlife, the colon and that pause could kind of represent that split second between life and death. And that to me is really when the poem is taking place. The events in the poem, what we're seeing in the poem, is taking place for the most part on that line between life and death. By the end of the poem, the speaker has moved into death or into the afterlife or into heaven, or however you want to look at it. And the fact that he's on that line between life and death, I think, is symbolised by the opening line, because they're waiting for him beyond Eden Rock, so he can see beyond Eden Rock, he can see beyond life, he can see into the afterlife, but he's not there yet. because they are waiting for him somewhere beyond Eden Rock, which would suggest that at the moment he's on the other side of Eden Rock. So if we're to think of Eden Rock as a kind of hard, impenetrable barrier that perhaps represents the line between life and death, then the speaker is on the life side, but he's able to look beyond because he's dying and he's seeing that window opening into heaven or into the afterlife. And that colon, that pause, perhaps represents that moment where he passes into that afterlife. Then what we get is a fairly simple description, a fairly basic description of his father. My father, 25, in the same suit of genuine Irish tweed, his terrier Jack, still 2 years old and trembling at his feet. It seems like quite a kind of idyllic picture, especially when you take in the mother and the fact that they're having a picnic. The only word that really stood out for me was the verb trembling. The dog is described as trembling at his feet, which could suggest a number of things. There's 3 ways, in my opinion, of reading this verb trembling. Why is it there? The first is that the dog simply is frightened of the father, and that the father is masterful. You know, the father has a kind of masterful, strong, domineering presence, and that the dog is frightened of the father. The second way of reading it is that the poet has put that verb into that stanza to introduce some movement into the stanza, because it's a very, very still picture. It's a snapshot of something, and without that movement, perhaps, you know, it might be rendered a little bit bland. So that bit of movement in that stanza gives it that kind of life. Okay, introduces a bit of movement into that what is quite a still scene. That movement, if we're to read it like that, could also represent the fact that this scene is becoming clearer as the speaker moves from life into the realm of death, into the realm of being reborn. The scene that you can see is becoming clearer, stronger, and movement is beginning to be introduced into the picture. It's a still picture, but then as he gets closer to it, as he passes into it, things start to move, things start to come alive, and it becomes more real. So perhaps that's why that movement has been introduced. The other way of looking at it, the third way of looking at it, is that perhaps the dog has sensed something. Perhaps the dog can see him coming. If we think about life and death, and we think about the end of life, it's often represented, particularly in films and in people recounting when they've been on the edge of life and death and they've come back. They often say they see a bright white light, which links to this line down here: the sky whitens as if lit by 3 suns. If we're to assume that there's this bright white light as the speaker dies and passes into this other world, and the dog is in this other world having this picnic, perhaps the dog has sensed him coming, the dog is fearful, scared, he's seen the light, or perhaps he's excited to see the speaker. So there's different ways of reading that verb trembling, but it's just worth being aware of. I personally like the idea of the poet introducing a bit of movement into it to suggest perhaps that this picture, this afterlife, is becoming more real and more clear as the speaker passes from, you know, the mortal coil into the afterlife. Moving on to the second stanza, we've got this description of the mother, and it's a very ordered poem. This is, you know, you've got this description of the father, you've got the colon at the beginning, which kind of represents, you know, okay, here we are, here are the things that I'm about to describe. Then you've got a very clear, simple description of the father. Then you've got the stanza break, and you've got the very clear description of the mother. The fact that her hair takes on the light could just be a reference to the sunlight. This is quite an idyllic place that the speaker is passing into. It's paradise, it's Eden, so it's probably sunny, it's probably a beautiful bright day. But perhaps her hair is taking on the light of the kind of flash of light as the speaker passes into that afterlife. And then what we have moving into the third stanza is movement. And that, to me, backs up my point earlier on, that trembling represents that idea that as the speaker passes from life into the afterlife, as that happens, the scene that he's passing into starts off quite still and static and begins to come alive as he moves into it. And part of that coming alive, part of that reality of what's happening and it becomes real, is that introduction of movement. We've got a little bit of movement in the first stanza. We've almost got a bit of movement in the second stanza with her hair taking on the light. You can almost imagine her turning and the light glancing off her hair. But in the third stanza, we've got proper movement. We've got the idea of her pouring tea from a thermos. We've got the idea of her slowly setting out 3 plates and cups painted blue. So we've got 2 verbs there, pause and sets, which suggest movement. There's not a lot of movement, and the movement is described as slow. Okay, and we've got actually a verb in the second stanza as well, spread. So we have got some movement in the second stanza as well. But what's beginning to happen as the speaker passes into this afterlife, the picture is starting to come alive, and it's coming alive through the poet's introduction of movement into the poem. And that is, I think, a structural point that you could talk about when you're writing about this poem. The idea of the way that the poet develops this picture by first of all describing it in quite static terms and then introducing movement slowly, and the way that introduction of movement represents that passing further and further from life, further and further into the afterlife or the afterworld or heaven or whatever you want to call it. The fact that they set out 3 plates suggests that they are expecting him. I'm not going to go down the road of assuming that 1 plate is for the dog. I would say that they are expecting him. Perhaps they've seen him at this point. And then what we get in the third stanza is a lot of movement. The sky whitens as if lit by 3 suns. That's quite sudden, that is. You know, that idea of the sky suddenly whitening very quickly. Powerful white light. What do we think of when we think of powerful white light? We think of the afterlife. We think of that tunnel that you hear people talk about. Oh, you know, I saw the white light, I saw Jesus calling for me or whatever, do you know what I mean? And there's that suddenly blast of white light. So this idea that this is now, the speaker is really finally on that moment where he really is fully passing into the afterlife now. And to go back up here, you know, they're waiting for me somewhere beyond Eden Rock, and that implies that the speaker is on the other side of Eden Rock. Perhaps we could assume now that the speaker has passed beyond Eden Rock. He's passed through that impenetrable, hard wall, which represents and symbolises the line, the dividing line between life and death. And we have this bright white light, and it's very sudden, and there's a lot of movement. And of course, you'll have noticed that we also have a simile. The sky whitened as if lit by 3 suns. There's that sense of rising drama from that simile. Something is about to happen. It's serious. And we have the characters, the other people in the poem, responding to that with movement. You know, we've got the mother shading her eyes. The mother shades her eyes and looks my way. So it's as if for the first time that the parents are actually seeing him now. They're noticing him. And again, that links into the idea that he's moved beyond Eden Rock, and he's now with them on the other side of Eden Rock. So if we're to take Eden Rock as symbolising the impenetrable wall between life and death, the speaker has now moved beyond that. She shades her eyes and looks my way over the drifted stream. And here's another kind of heavy piece of symbolism, which I would say is more clear in some ways than the idea of the rock. The stream to me really does clearly symbolise that dividing line between life and death. And you've got these lines like, they beckon me from the other bank, I hear them calling, see where the stream path is, crossing it is not as hard as you might think. You know, to me that line may as well read, see where the line is between life and death, you can cross that line, come to us. That idea of them beckoning him. My father spins a stone along the water leisurely. So we've got more movement in this scene now. We've got more going on. There's, as the poems develop, more and more movement has been introduced. The picture has become more and more real, more and more vividly rendered, if you like. They beckon to me from the other bank, so they're calling him. You notice a little bit of enjambment here. My father spins a stone along the water leisurely. i.e. he leisurely spins a stone along the water, or my father spins a stone along the water. Leisurely, they beckon me from the other bank. So you've got that enjambment there where the poet's playing with that word, leisurely. But either way, this is a relaxed picture. They beckon me from the other bank, so they're calling to him. I hear them call, see where the stream path is. Crossing it is not as hard as you might think. Just like I said a minute or two ago, that stream symbolising that line between life and death. The speaker here is now really passing into the afterlife. So you've got that development from the end of life, if you like, the last breath represented by that colon, to really passing through that kind of barrier into the afterlife. And then you've got this final stanza. I had not thought that it would be like this. Now there's something that I want to quickly pick up on here, and that is the structure of the poem. And the reason that I sometimes talk about the structure of these poems is because if you really want to get those top marks, if you really want to be getting into that top band, you need to be bringing structure and form into it. So one of the things that I noticed when I was reading through this poem is that it's comprised for the most part of 4-line stanzas. Stanza 1's 4 lines, stanza 2's 4 lines, stanza 3's 4 lines, stanza 4 is 4 lines, stanza 5 is 3 lines. Why? My theory is that it represents that idea of things quickening. This journey that the speaker is making into the afterlife, into heaven, has suddenly sped up because he's getting closer and closer. The pace of it quickens. Perhaps his heartbeat quickens as he takes his last breaths. But the journey is just quickening, isn't it? He's there now. Do you know what I mean? He's just passing through, going down that tunnel of white light, if you like to use that cliche that you get in the films. It's quickening up, and that's why these stanzas are shortening, and the final stanza is reduced to just one single line. I had not thought that it would be like this, and that one line to me represents that he's now there. The journey is over. That's why we're down to one line. But I'm going to pick up on another point. The tense has changed. The whole poem is in the present tense. They beckon. The sky whitens. She pours tea. It's happening, in the present. There's a change in tense in that final line into, first of all, the past tense. That's the most important thing to understand, that it changes into the past tense. It changes into what we call the past perfect tense. Why does it change into the past tense? Because what we have in this final line is the speaker looking back. The speaker has now died. He's fully passed into this world, into the afterlife, into heaven, and he's looking back. And that change of tense represents the end of that. It represents the fact that he's looking back. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take you over here to this table that I've made. And all I've done really is here, I'm just recapping really some of the stuff that I've just been through for you, because this is quite a tough poem to write about, in my opinion. First of all, I want to talk about some of the language in the poem, some of the language features or language devices. Let's call them language devices. We can talk about the imagery. There is tons of it. Okay, so although there's not that many language features in there, there's not personification or onomatopoeia, and there's only the one similar da 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 da. There's tons and tons of imagery. My father, 25, in the same suit, genuine Irish treed, his terrier Jack trembling at his feet. Imagery. It's all the way through the poem. Okay, so you can talk about the imagery if you're asked to write about this poem. You can talk about the writer's use of imagery, the poet's use of that idyllic imagery to represent the fact that the afterlife is somewhere beautiful, somewhere pleasant, somewhere heavenly. You could talk about the way that the imagery changes, and it starts off very static with not a lot of movement, and the way that it moves and begins to come alive and begins to kind of become more and more strong and intense as the poem goes on. The sky whitens as if lit by 3 suns, that intense imagery to represent the fact that this world is becoming more real as the speaker dies. The symbolism, We've got this symbolism going on, the symbolism of Eden, what Eden suggests, what it connotates, what it symbolises: paradise, heaven, the afterlife, rebirth, the beginning of something. We've got the symbolism of the rock, and what I talked about, it being a kind of hard, impenetrable face, and the speaker kind of moving past that as he dies, as he goes into this other world. We've got the symbolism, the metaphor of the stream. They call him over the stream, the stream again symbolising that kind of line between life and death, and then the idea of him having to cross the stream. And I also like this idea of, we've got this line, see where the stream path is. This idea of that path not being visible until now, and it's pointed out to him, that path into death, into the other world, not being visible when you're alive, because you're alive, so you can't see it, it's not there, it's invisible. But as he dies, the path begins to show itself. You can talk about that, you can talk about the symbolism of that, the symbolism of the stream, what it represents. Of course, you can talk about the simile, the sky whitens as if lit by three suns. That's something to look at as well if you were asked to write about this poem. Because if you're going to write about these poems, you need to be able to pick out language, you need to be able to pick out structure. Certainly if you want to go for the good marks, you've got to talk about structure as well. The sky whitens as if lit by three suns. You've got a nice simile there. You can talk about the effect of that, the fact that it's an intense image, the simile adds intensity. This is a very real, intense experience. It started off as quite a static, kind of basic, almost banal experience. The language to me is quite basic and boring and static in the first stanza. By the fourth stanza, you've got this very intense imagery, very intense simile. The sky whitens as if lit by three suns. And finally, you can talk about strong verbs in the poem: trembling, spread. Verbs that introduce movement, pause, sets, lit, shades, spins, beckon. They go on and on. That brings us on to structure. If I was going to talk about the structure in this poem, I'd talk about the development, the introduction of movement through the poem, and the way that movement is introduced as the world becomes more real. It goes from almost being a still image, like a photo, to being a real world as the speaker is kind of reborn and passes into it. And the development, we call that development, the way that the poem develops, the way that the events develop. I would talk about the shorter stanzas to represent the quickening of things, when the speaker approaches the end of that journey and he begins to think, actually, I am going to go with this, I'm not going to hang on anymore, I'm going with it, I'm passing through this now. Things are picking up pace and he's getting closer and closer and he's there. And those shorter stanzas to me represent that. And I would talk about those shorter stanzas and the way that the poet has used two shorter stanzas at the end. That structure, you can talk about that. And again, this final point I've put, it could be structure, it could be language, it doesn't really matter. But I would talk about the final line, the change in tense, the change from the present tense to the past tense, that represents the speaker's passing, the speaker's moving on, and he's been looking at a picture all the way through, and then he's getting closer and closer and becoming more involved in the picture. But by the end of it, he's standing in the picture, looking back at his life. I had not thought it would be like this. That past tense to represent the fact that the speaker has now passed. He's now fully immersed in this world. What started out as a very static, still world, almost like a still image. So there's lots and lots and lots you can say about this poem. Like I said at the beginning of the tutorial, it's an abstract poem that's written very simply. And those are the most difficult poems to unlock in many ways, because they don't jump out at you with hundreds and hundreds of language features and things that you can say. And yet at the same time, it's difficult to work out what the hell they're about. So this is a fairly tough poem. I've given you quite a lot there. I've not exhausted the poem by any means, but there's quite a lot to get on with there. And it'd probably be a good idea to make a table, perhaps with some of these points, imagery, get some quotes out, symbolism, get some quotes out, structure, get some quotes, and just get confident with it. And you know, if you get confident with it, you'll be fine. So, good luck with it. If you like the videos, subscribe, like, etc., etc. And yeah, check out some of my other videos. I'll see you next time.